Hey everybody, Johnny here. In this video, we're going to talk about making a threaded rod generator in geometry nodes. This is something you can use to make a mesh that you can tie onto something like a bottle, or use later to make a threaded pipe. I wanted to let you know, while this tutorial is out here for you to use, if you're interested in getting the source files, you can check out my Patreon page. The link's in the description. Let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to want to do is take any mesh, in this case we'll just use our default cube, and we'll add a geometry node tree to it. Since this node is going to generate the object we want, we can just disconnect the input geometry here. And under the N panel, if we go to group, we can delete the geometry input. Since we're creating a threaded rod, the first thing we'll need is the rod itself. For this, we'll just use a mesh primitive cylinder. We'll want to be able to control the radius, the depth, the number of vertices, and the number of side segments. Once we have that, we're going to need a spiral to wrap around this cylinder. So we'll add a curved primitive spiral. We want this spiral to have the same radius as our cylinder, so we'll just plug that in to both the start and the end radius. And for now, we're just going to join these two geometries. Using a geometry, join geometry node. The next thing we want is to set the height of the spiral equal to the height of the cylinder. So we'll hook up the depth here to the height of the spiral. Now we may or may not want the spiral to be the exact same height as our cylinder. So let's go ahead and add a multiplier to this, so that we can shrink down the spiral compared to the cylinder. We'll go to Utilities, Math, and multiply the height by some value. We can connect that value to our input, and we'll call that the spiral height factor. Minimum value should be 0, maximum value should be 1. Now you've probably noticed that our spiral is starting from the middle of our cylinder, so we're going to want to shift it down half its height. We'll use a set position node for this. We'll use a combined vector node on our offset, and we'll attach in our height. Of course, this is going in the wrong direction, so let's go ahead and multiply that by -1. Now we've got the opposite problem, so what we actually need to do is multiply this by -0.5, so it shifts it down, which is the negative, and 0.5, which is half. So now our spiral height factor is affecting the curve the way we want. I'm going to change this vertices name to resolution, and I'm going to connect the resolution both to the side segments of our cylinder and to the resolution of our spiral. We'll want to be able to control how many rotations our spiral makes around our cylinder, so we'll connect rotations to our input. I'm going to duplicate my group input just to clean things up a little. Next, we'll want to give our spiral some thickness. So after we've set its position, we'll use a curve to mesh node. And we'll use a curved circle as our profile. Now we'll probably want to control the resolution of our circles, so we'll connect that in to resolution here. Because this is going around the perimeter of our curved circle, we don't necessarily want it to be the same resolution as our spiral and our cylinder. We'll also want to be able to control the radius of our spiral. In my curve to mesh, I'll enable the Fill Caps button. If the threaded rod you're making is going to stay solid like this one, then you won't necessarily have to do a Boolean between the cylinder and the spiral. For instance, if I duplicate this one and apply its node tree, we can see how it looks, but if we look in the middle of it, we see that the spiral and the cylinder are two very separate objects. However, if we're going to be making something hollow, like the threaded end of a pipe, we're not going to want the inside of the spiral inside of our cylinder. So let's give ourselves an option. Here, I'm going to add a mesh Boolean node and set the type to union. I'll connect in our cylinder and our spiral. Now if I connect this to the output, duplicate this, and apply its modifier, if I delete this top face, you'll see that the inside no longer has the other side of the spiral. But here's the thing. The mesh Boolean node is notoriously slow. If I turn on my timings, we see that this node takes 74 milliseconds to finish, and the mass majority of that is in the mesh Boolean node. Whereas if I hook this up to my join geometry, you'll see that I'm at 0.27 milliseconds to run this. So obviously, if you don't need this to be unioned, this will work a lot faster. So what I'll do here is add a switch node. I'll put my join geometry in false and my Boolean in true. Then I'll plug in the switch to my input and call this Boolean. Now with the flip of this switch, I can select between the slower Boolean or the faster join. If I reduce my spiral height factor a little bit, you'll see that it's always centered around the middle of our cylinder. But what if you want this to be more towards the top or more towards the bottom? Well, we could simply shift our spiral up and down based on an input. So here, before our curve to mesh node, I'm going to add a geometry transform. Now, I could do this with another set position node, but there's something else that I want to do that the transform's going to give us. Here, I'm going to duplicate this combine XYZ and plug it into the translation. From my input, I'll plug into the Z. Now I have control on where on the cylinder I want the spiral to be. So now I can duplicate my combine XYZ again, plug this vector into the rotation, and use this Z from my input. Now I can change the starting position of my spiral. So let's rename these. This one will be Z spiral offset. This will be Z spiral rotation. Here I'm going to clean up a couple of names. Another thing we may want to do is reverse the direction of our spiral. So over here we can use this Boolean input of our spiral to do just that. From this input, I'll drag in a new input here and call it reverse spiral. One last thing we might want to do is have the ends of our spiral taper out. We can do that by setting the endpoints of our spiral's radius to 0. So here, after our spiral, I'm going to add a curve set radius node. First, we need to set the radius to 1 meter. That way, the radius that we have down here will stay the same. Basically, our radius is 1 at this point. My blender is set up to be in millimeters, so that's why this says 1,000 millimeters rather than 1 meter. But now that I have this, I'll duplicate it again and set the radius to 0. Now, I just have to tell it what points that I want to set to 0. For that, I'll use the curve endpoint selection node and plug that into this selection here. So now my endpoints taper out nicely. If you wanted to make the taper out optional, we could add another switch node, have the taper be true, and have skipping the taper be false. And then we could simply drag one more input, taper ends, and now we have that option. I'm going to rename this node threaded rod and mark it as an asset. So now let's see it in action. Here I've got the top of a bottle that I want to model this thread. I'm going to move this into place and start making some adjustments. Now that that looks good, I'll duplicate it, apply my modifier, and set it to Shade Auto Smooth. From here, I could continue to model out the rest of the bottle. And there you have it, a pretty decent looking thread generator. I would imagine you could use this to generate screws, pipe threads, or really anything else in that manner. I hope you find this helpful, and I hope it inspires you to make something awesome. So until next time, I'll catch you later.